Welcome to this McKinsey Global Institute virtual event.
Well, welcome everyone. I'm Chris Bradley. I'm a senior partner with McKinsey and I'm a director of the McKinsey Global Institute. And I'm here with a bunch of my co-authors of this new research that we're really excited about called The Next Big Arenas of Competition. It's part of our ongoing research around a theme of technology and markets of the future. And we're just really delighted to be able to bring you the insights of hundreds of our industry experts into one report. Now, you might be saying, well, Chris, what's an arena of competition? We're going to explain that. And we're going to do it with some of my co-authors. So we're going to kick off with just a tour of the report's findings. So joining me to do that is both together with us in London is Michael Bersham. He's a senior partner. He globally leads our strategy and corporate finance practice. And he's also a long-standing member of the MGI Council and one of the co-authors on the report. And he's joined by Quaylin Ellingrod, one of my fellow MGI directors, usually from Minnesota, but with us in London today here, and also a co-author of the report. And then we've got a panel because a big part of this was integrating lots of viewpoints about these industries. So we've got a panel that's going to bring some of the actual arenas to life for us. So to do that, joining us in New York, we have Gayatri Chennai. She's a senior partner. She's going to talk to us about things around cloud and AI and cybersecurity. We've got Humayun Tai, also in New York, another one of our senior partners. He also leads our global energy and materials practice. And he's going to talk to, because global energy and material, believe it or not, has a lot of these arenas. He's going to talk to us about things like batteries and EVs and new materials. And then in Boston, we have Annie Kelkar joining us. And he's one of our contributing authors as well. And he's going to talk about shared autonomous vehicles and robotics, which I think is going to be really fascinating. Now, we'd love to take your questions. We love this to be as interactive as possible. So if you throw questions into the comments, we'll use them throughout the session. So there should be a Q&A tab on the right-hand side of your screen to do that. So, but for now, without further ado, let me hand over to Quaylin and Michael to explain what is a next big arena of competition. Thanks, guys.
Wonderful. Thanks, Chris. So what are arenas of competition and why should you care? For a number of reasons. And what we did to identify arenas of competition is we looked historically at what they have been over the last 15, 20 years. And then we looked ahead and we identified what we think the next set of arenas of competition are. And a few things that really set these arenas apart. One is they show outsized growth and dynamism, a lot of action happening in these arenas. There's a certain formula or potion for these that we'll talk through, and there's three main ingredients of a technological or business model change, escalatory dynamics, more winner takes all in terms of investments, and large and growing markets that are addressable. And I think as we look ahead and identify the next 18 arenas that we think will be where all of the action is, right? All of the investment, all of the outsized growth and profitability, and actually up to a third of global GDP will be concentrated in these 18 arenas, we believe. They're really going to transform the industrial landscape and be the bulk of, new and entering companies, increased employment growth, but really kind of dynamism and excitement in our industrial landscape. So with those broad themes, let's jump in. And first, let's look historically at the arenas of competition, how we define them, and what really makes them up. I think first, when we were thinking about this topic, we started to look at, what was the top 10 list of companies in terms of market cap 15, 20 years ago. So we looked back to 2005. And what you see here on the left side is a bunch of oil companies, conglomerates, banks, right? The top 10 back in 2005 was GE, ExxonMobil, GSK, more pharmaceuticals, Citi, BP, Microsoft. And as you move ahead then to 2020, actually none of those, except for one, Microsoft, was still in the top 10. And we looked around and asked the question of why? Why so much turnover over the course of 15 years? What's driving that turnover? And why is Microsoft in tech, right, the only sort of remaining top 10 company? Over that time frame, you also have kind of a 5x of market cap between 2005 to 2020, from kind of 2.5 trillion back in 2005 to more like 12 trillion on average in 2020. 5x, much faster than the overall rate of market appreciation or certainly GDP growth. And as you flip ahead to now kind of 2024, today, very much the same set of leaders, a little bit of shift. You have number 3 here, NVIDIA, not even in the top 10 in 2020, bursting onto the scene in the number 3 spot, and even more kind of tumultuousness and movement across the top 10. And so our question in leading this research, digging into this research, was really, what's driving this, and how can we better understand the long-term trends that are making these shifts? So let's jump into this. What we looked at when we started to define kind of the backwards looking, the history view of what are the next arenas that shape our world today, how we live, how businesses are growing and shrinking, we looked at 2 main dimensions. And on the x-axis here, you have industry share growth. It's kind of a relative growth rate of that industry compared to others. And we looked across 57 different industries. That's the x-axis. On the y-axis, we measured an element we call dynamism, right? How much, we actually measured it through a shuffle rate. How much is market share changing hands within this industry in terms of those that are gaining market share versus losing? And that's our y-axis, our shuffle rate or dynamism measure. And as you plot all 57 of those industries on this kind of view, what you see is on the bottom right, bottom left, and kind of the left side of things, those that are sort of lower in growth rate, and there's a whole bunch of them here in gray. These are kind of our non-arenas, right? Slower growing, perhaps maybe less dynamic sets of industries. And overall, you see them overall growing, shrinking, frankly, negative growth rate, and around a 45 to 50 kind of share in terms of a shuffle rate or dynamism measure. Then we looked at arenas, and these are kind of those right side, higher growth rates, but also kind of higher dynamism and shuffle rate here. Overall, these arenas in blue were higher growth rates, right? 2 to 3 percentage point growth compared to negative growth for the others, and also more like a 60, 65 shuffle rate, so much higher dynamism here. And if you compare kind of the arenas over on the right side, much higher growth, much higher dynamism. We'll talk about a few other things that actually define these arenas as well. But these on the right are the 12 big arenas of competition that we could identify in 2005 and really track their growth, dynamism, but other elements that defined those and really differentiated those 12 compared to the rest of the 57 industries. So that was the snapshot view in 2005 to 2020. If you flip ahead and actually fast forward to today, we wanted to kind of back test with the very latest data. Does it still hold true in 2023? And in fact, you see a very consistent view of the next arenas, or the current arenas, frankly, with this rear view mirror. In fact, some of them are even higher. So you see cloud, EV, even further up into the right, continuing their arena status with higher growth and frankly, higher dynamism. You also see semiconductors making a huge jump in both the X and the Y axis from NVIDIA's big entry right into that top 3 that we saw earlier. So these are the 12 arenas of the 57. And we wanted to dig into further what sets apart these 12 arenas from the others. And there's a few things. One, higher rate of growth in revenues, right? 10% CAGR in the arenas versus 4% for the non-arenas. Also, their market cap, no surprise, is reflecting that outsized growth. So 16% market cap CAGR for arenas versus 6% for the non-arenas. Those 12 arenas of competition also differed in other ways. On the next page, they had higher economic profit. We looked both in 2019, kind of pre-COVID, and 2020, a little bit more skewed by COVID numbers, but outsized economic profit numbers relative to the non-arenas. They had higher R&D investment, about twice the rate of R&D investment compared to the non-arenas. There were more new businesses, new entrants. About a third of the market cap was dominated by new entrants compared to about half of that for non-arenas. They were more likely to be the home of giants. So Companies with greater than 200 billion market cap, about half of the market cap in arenas were owned by giants compared to 15% outside. So more kind of winner take all, winner take more, which is what you see here. The top 10 players in arenas had about 75% of that market cap compared to about 56% outside, and much more global. Over 2/3 of the companies had at least 20% of their revenues outside their home country, so much more cross-border and global. And the other dimension that was really interesting was arenas, kind of market cap of the arenas was much more likely to be either based in the US with more giants or based in China. About 65% of the market cap of these 12 arenas, as you start with payments most skewed, video and entertainment, software, consumer electronics, blended average 65% of the market cap of these arenas was grounded in the US. Another about 15% grounded in Greater China, and that's more skewed on the bottom part of the chart, industrial electronics, semiconductors, consumer internet, e-commerce, a little bit in EVs there. But across this blended average, 65% of the market cap in the US, 15% in China, a smaller share in Europe, interestingly. Europe has more of those smaller, mid-sized companies and fewer of these giants that you see kind of dominating in these next arenas of competition. And so with that historical look, we had identified, right, the 12 of the 57. And we said, what can we learn from that historical look back that can inform us about how these arenas are formed and what the future ones will be? Michael?
Super. Well, thank you, Quaylin, and hello, everybody. Delighted to be with you. And as Quaylin was saying, so we know what arenas are, we know they matter, and we know the arenas of today. But if we're going to find the next big ones, we need to know where arenas come from. We need to know essentially the arena creation potion. And as we did our research, we think, and again, delighted to debate this, but we think it comes down to three ingredients. Firstly, a technological or business model step change, a fundamental transformation in how products and services are developed or delivered. Now, that could be technological. Think, how much energy per kilogram can be stored in a battery. It could be business model, like streaming, for example, where we used to buy or permanently or rent temporarily a DVD, and then we now subscribe in an ongoing way to essentially a virtual DVD store. So, and sometimes it could be both. Semiconductors, for example, we saw both change in technology and change then in the value chain with fabless production, for example. So we have the technological or business model step change that unlocks something. And what it unlocks for it to be an arena is an escalatory dynamic in investment. And what for us that means is that the increased investment isn't just about increasing volume. It's about fundamentally improving competitive advantage, right? Whether that's by racing to acquire customers or by building brand, substantially expanding production at scale, improving quality. Essentially, you can't, in these arenas, as a result of the technological or business model step change, you can't dip your toe in the water. You have to go big or bold. And then your competitor has to go bigger and bolder, and so on. And third, there is a large or fast-growing too large market, right? And that could either be a new one, think mobile phones at the time, or it could be an existing one that's being disrupted, think payments, for example, in the arenas of today. And what that means is that the arms race that we just described isn't going to stop anytime soon, and it's an arms race that's worth winning. So for our mind, those are the three ingredients of the arena creation potion. And then we started looking for evidence of those ingredients as we settled on the arenas of tomorrow. But just to dig a little bit deeper into the escalatory dynamics, if you look on the next page, you can see just how significant that is. So if you take the six major tech players, which obviously play in a number of different arenas, but some of the core arenas of today, and look at what happened to their capex and R&D from 2005 to 2020. Right? In 2005, it was $13 billion across in total, and in 2020, it was $250 billion. Right? A CAGR of 22% and a 20-fold increase. So very substantial escalatory dynamics. So if that's the arena creation potion, what are the arenas of the future? And we'll shortly share, as Quailin mentioned, the 18 potential arenas that we've identified, as well as 8 that we judged possible, but perhaps too uncertain to call. And as we do that, I and my co-authors and our firm, we certainly do that with all due humility. We are well aware of the thought that it is difficult to make predictions, particularly about the future. And we have gone into this with the sense that we may be wrong, but we hope at least we will be interesting. I should also say that sometimes, maybe we'll explore this in the questions, we face judgments about were we seeing one arena or two, and if two, what's the right way to divide it? Is the real arena the larger but perhaps slightly less dynamic industry, or the smaller but more dynamic sub-industry? So we made judgments, and obviously we're happy to debate. So with those caveats, here are the 18 arenas. And they're ordered from left to right, top to bottom by estimated revenue in 2040, and we'll show a bit more of that detail on the next page. These 18, we will show it, but we won't show it now. We will talk about the 18 first. So these 18, they fall into a few categories. So firstly, 4 of the arenas are arenas that Quailin introduced, arenas of today that continue tomorrow. The game is still very much underway. There's cloud services, e-commerce, electric vehicles, and semiconductors. 3 arenas of the future are spin-offs of arenas today, where we believe that a sub-industry is really where the growth and dynamism will happen, and so merits being an arena itself that spins off. This is digital advertisements, which spin off from today's consumer internet. Also AI software and services spinning off from software, and streaming videos spinning off from video and audio entertainment. The remaining 11 are new arenas, and hopefully most of them do what it says on the tin, but maybe just a couple to highlight. So future air mobility, that's electric vertical takeoff and landing vehicles, delivery drones, for example. Industrial and consumer biotech, that's things like ag tech, alternative proteins, consumer products and services like personalized wellness, biomaterials and biochemicals like plastics. For example, and then obviously, if you have been following closely, you'll know that 5 arenas of today that Quailin shared, we think probably revert to still highly important, but more normal industries: biopharma, consumer electronics, industrial electronics, information-enabled business services, and payments. If you then do look on the next page, you have some of the numbers by arena, and obviously there's a lower and a higher case. There's a huge amount of uncertainty around these, but obviously our experts are very happy to debate assumptions with you. These would be 4% of GDP in 2020, rising to 10 to 16%. Of GDP in 2040, depending on the high case or the low case. So that is 18 to 34%, as Quailin was saying, up to a third of total GDP growth in the coming era could come from these arenas. Now, these aren't the only arenas. There were some others to consider. And if you look on the next page, you will see 8 that were almost emergent arenas. And again, we're very happy to debate these. And some of them, the question, let's say products and services for older adults, the question was, is the dynamism really going to be there to justify the arena. In some of them, it was more, is the growth really going to be there, which depends, for example, on the pace of the green transition, for example. In some cases, is there really going to be a technological breakthrough sufficient to create that step change, that first ingredient in the arena's potion? So those are 8 that we could debate as possibilities. And then what does this all mean for business leaders? So a number of questions for you, for all of us. One, am I in an arena? Right? And if I'm in an arena, or could I be in an arena? How do I invest? How do I build the capabilities to win? There are these escalatory dynamics. How do I get the capital? How do I move far and fast? Equally, am I a potential customer of these arenas? If you think about who harnessed e-commerce or harnessed cloud services, for example, in the run-up to today, those who did that better gained competitive advantage. So how can I harness as a anchor customer, for example, the new arenas? Am I a supplier? Could I be a supplier into those arenas, and what does that mean? And some of these may be the behemoths of tomorrow. How do I think about managing, for example, the risks that might be created from that supply? So what's my strategy to supply in? Obviously, think about banking as payments developed. If I'm being disrupted and there's a new area, what am I going to do? Right? Could I disrupt myself? Could I jump in? And of course, am I someone who could invest in these? And obviously, there's an extent of it's better to pick the winner, but maybe if I'm just investing across that arena, am I going to create value for those who give me capital? So those are some of the questions that we could explore as we get into the specifics of some of those arenas. And then finally, just to say that this, obviously, as Chris mentioned on the next page, is a collaborative effort across the McKinsey Global Institute and the wider firm, with many folks involved. This is a selection of the folks involved in this, and some of them are on the panel. So Chris, I think over to you as we dig into the questions from the audience.
Thanks, Michael. A few questions have actually already come in from the audience, and one of them comes around to this idea that the boundaries of these arenas are pretty gooey, aren't they? So Apple's kind of playing in video, and it's in AI, and it's in consumer electronics, and so there is this idea that they do operate in ecosystems. That's one of the reasons why they have such a outsized influence. And I think there's also another question around, hey, is this US kind of dominance going to continue? I think that's a really interesting question. I mean, if you look at some of the new arenas coming, I think Europe's got a shot at some of them. For example, we've got Novo Nordisk in the space of the obesity medication, and in places like robotics, there's lots of capability in Europe. One point we always want to make about the arenas is the game's not over. It keeps playing out again and again. You might win the gold medal now, and that means a lot. But hey, the starting gun's going to fire in 4 more years when the race is going to start again. So that's our whole point about this shuffle rate and the dynamism. So what I'm going to do now is move to let's explore some of these arenas together. And to do that, as I said in the tee up, we're going to be joined by 3 of my colleagues. So I've got Gayatri, Humayun, and Ani with me here. So I'm going to start with you, Gayatri. So let's look at AI, cloud, and cybersecurity. Lord, they're just everywhere already. Like ChatGPT already has more web traffic than Netflix does. There's already hundreds of billions of dollars being invested in cloud by just a few players. I think it's from 2016 to 21. I've got here 3 players invested over $380 billion building the cloud, and those numbers seem to only be going up. And cybersecurity, it looks like it's already costing us $4 to $6 trillion in losses a year. So these things are already here. So I guess the question I'm going to throw to you, and it's not an easy one, is yes, but what does it mean 15 years out, how those industries are going to look into the future. So what's the race to the top going to look like in these arenas that are already so radically being shaped?
Thank you. It's a great question. And first of all, thanks for having me here today. It's great to be here. It's an interesting question because, often we combine all of these and put them as a technology bucket, and we are recognizing more so now than ever before. These are different. And even within AI, I think of it as two segments, if we were to describe the AI industry. One which is focused more on the building of the foundational models. And think of these as the most advanced models which perform a wide variety of tasks using expansive artificial neural networks and using enormous sets of varied data. The other, when we describe AI, consists of companies that produce software and services and that fulfill a wide variety of specific needs within the economy. So even when we talk AI, it's these two very different segments. And when we look at it in a little bit more detail, the frontier model segment, to me, this has a few major players right now. As we look towards the future, it probably will be similar because building a foundational model requires access to massive amounts of data, massive amounts of capital, infrastructure, talent, hard to get resources. And so these pose challenges even for established technology companies and create barriers to entry. There are also barriers to entry on the semiconductor industry front because these chips that we are using, they are scarce. Every other industry, including automobile, wants them. So there is an edge to companies that have access to these kinds of capital and these kinds of cutting edge talent. And this then creates a virtuous circle, which we think will continue, making it difficult for competitors to enter. However, when we look at the AI software segment, that looks very different. That looks more like the software market, quite fragmented. There's a wide variety of needs and applications that these companies need to fulfill in the economy. And as such, there is going to be a continual emergence of new companies, new competitors that will outcompete and create space for new entrants. Here, also, the barriers of entry are understandably lower. Large companies and the incumbents tend to focus on a few profitable, scalable use cases, but that then means there is an opportunity to tailor products to more narrower use cases or more specialized and nuanced use cases that leave space for others to enter. The cloud side is, I would say, dominated by 4 large players. So you talked about, in the last 5 years, $380 billion, not the last 5, but like in between 2017, 2021, $380 billion was poured in terms of capital by these large 4 players into building infrastructure. And that is data centers, which is the heart of how cloud computing works. So there, to enter into cloud at scale, there are significant network effects. There are significant scale and scope advantages that the large players have, and that does create high barriers to entry. I think in the long term, if we take a view on what happens in the cloud, I think it's one of 2 scenarios. One is where the industry continues to have these few large players, given the escalatory dynamics and the global radius of competition. I think the other play could well be that because of data sovereignty regulations and new investments in the regions, to the point you were making, where Europe starts becoming more interesting and so on, we could start seeing some level of fragmentation that comes in from the emergence of regional players. So that's the play that is yet to play out, and we'll have to see how that goes. The last thing I'll say is on the cybersecurity front. Now, this could look very different from the rest. Is how it currently looks. It's fairly granular and like very, very competitive, highly fragmented. The top 10 cyber companies, I think, generate less than 20% of the revenues in the market. So this is driven primarily because of the wide variety of use cases in there on cyber, wide variety of threats, different regulations country to country, and that drives largely highly fragmented market set there.
So it's fascinating. I saw a statistic that fascinated me, which is that Microsoft recently, which is investing something like $100 billion a year at the moment, but they spent more on CapEx than they did in R&D. So the world's really first big software company is not a software company anymore, it's an infrastructure company. So I think that's what's so fascinating about AI and cloud, to the extent it's backed by silicon and concrete and air conditioning, all these things in a really physical sense. And I think we've even seen them starting to kind of think about nuclear power. I'm going to come to that for Humayun later. But let's talk cyber, which is probably one of the ones that has an industry structure that looks more traditional now and maybe less arena-like. And I guess the question is, what would change in cyber security for there to be the emergence of giant companies like a Salesforce of cybersecurity? What would have to happen?
So look, I think on cyber, the reality is that we are seeing a lot more specialized from a geopolitical lens, right? Like we are seeing a lot more complex and a lot more frequent cyber attacks. And that then is leading to a bit of the current market space. I personally see that only continuing to get bigger and more critical. The other thing that is happening from a technological advancement perspective, we are seeing a lot more on the quantum side. And as quantum comes in, the current cryptographic methods that are used in current cybersecurity measurements and monitoring and mitigation, those become more obsolete. So that poses significant more challenges to the cybersecurity ecosystem. And both of these, I think, combined together will largely probably cause more specialized, nuanced companies that cater to very offensive techniques, defensive techniques. But there is a lot of uncertainty, I would say, in how this plays out in terms of consolidation. It more necessitates the rethinking of cybersecurity strategies.
So I think, it's just hard to imagine in some ways the profound impact this is all going to have on us. We'll come back later. I'm going to keep moving around the dial. Let's go to Humayun. So, there's a question around here of why isn't climate tech more prominent in our arenas? And it's certainly very prominent, but one thing we found, for example, like during this period, we looked at all these arenas exploding. China urbanized and built a huge banking system, and we saw massive growth in the amount of people in the world who are being banked and living in cities and using steel. But banks and steel companies didn't become arenas of competition. They just scaled with the economy. And a steel mill still looks like a steel mill. But I want to now come to nuclear, because it's kind of the touch on from AI. And we did have a clean energy revolution in the 70s, and instead of Taylor Swift being at the top of the charts, it was Pink Floyd. But the energy went from 2% of the electricity supply globally to 18% in about 20 years. So it's like an epic scale up, like not dissimilar actually to the current scale up of solar. And COP28, 25 countries have made commitments to triple nuclear capacity, and already we've got China's planning to build 150 of these things. I think in our arenas of competition, I think we said there's 8 being built a year at the moment, and our top scenario it's 100. So Humayun, over to you. Talk nuclear to us. What could happen here? Why is nuclear potentially an arena of competition?
It's so interesting, Chris, as you laid out some of the facts that even 5 years ago, when we thought about clean tech and we thought about the net zero transition and the role electricity plays in powering the mitigation in emissions and the transition of gas-fired generation to baseload clean renewables generation. Or if you think about building electrification, you think about transport electrification. We'll talk about EVs, batteries later. I know all of that. The whole thing that supports that is the conversion of fossil-based to clean, carbon-free electricity, right? So that's sort of the premise. 5 years ago, that was the big focus, was on the power sector side. How do we transition that side to carbon-free? And then that drives the rest of the economy. Now, the reality is 5 years ago, we didn't talk about nuclear as much. The idea was nuclear was going to wrap up in the next 40, 50 years as these plants that were built in the 1990s and 2000s, the last few, were going to be done. And a few countries like China were continuing to build. But really, we had seen the sunset. The big dramatic change, and which is why we think this is a big arena to watch, is the realization that the many renewables fleets we convert and we build, the issue is going to be that we need to have more baseload generation that backs that up. And unfortunately, the baseload generation that we have is carbon intense. So it's in the form of coal right now, and forget OECD economies. I'm thinking about emerging markets, where you've got coal dominating in terms of really providing a baseload of energy for the system. You've got natural gas, which will continue across OECD and emerging markets. So the question really, I think, policymakers and environmentalists and many people have realized is that you need something to substitute for the firming of capacity to support renewables and therefore cleaning the power sector, which then cleans everything else up. And so nuclear is where the attention is focused, because nuclear is clean. It gives you a baseload profile. It's easy to run. Once you get through the CapEx stage, which we'll talk about, which is problematic and is challenging. But once you get past that, it runs pretty much on its own, and it has a long life. So that's where the nuclear discussion has turned. A lot of innovation has happened. For example, maybe at least 10 years back, we were looking at 4 or 5 large OEMs globally for the large reactors. Right now, we have over 25 smaller companies looking at SMRs and micro reactors. So the level of innovation is also accelerated in this. So dynamism, as we talk about, those are the factors which have really reset the interest in nuclear.
Yeah, it's got all the elements. We talked about the potion, and I think SMRs might be one of the change, but there's a big demand opening up. But, I think the thing is that building these things is really, really hard. And it has all the things we expect of like a race to kind of master the technology. So, but I mean, the narrative of how you feel about nuclear just seems to really depend on where you live. So if I'm a South Korean, I'm pretty positive about it. They built 12 of the things. They did it for, $4 million a megawatt. But if you're in where we are here in UK and you've got Hinkley, it costs so much more than that. So what's the unlock going to be there, Aman, in your view?
Yes, and I think you're right. The most competitive reactors, like the Korea reactor you've talked about, there's one in the Middle East, which is in the $3 to $5 million per megawatt range. And the cost overruns that we've seen in the US have been up to $13 million a megawatt. If you look at some of the Nordic deployments, also expensive. So the industry is reeling from a bit of a vicious cycle on cost, meaning cost overruns have been dramatic. And so there's a pullback, and it's not just from broadly the OEMs were worried, but it's from the financial sector and the insurance sector. It's a bunch of different things coming together to make this restrictive. So to your question, Chris, on what is the unlock here? One of the biggest unlocks is going to be the offtake. Can somebody guarantee, and I'm taking both an OEM perspective and a developer perspective, because there may be different players there. Somebody may be developing technology as the reactor unit, and then somebody may be developing the reactor itself and the full power plant. So from both those perspectives, the offtake is really important. If you don't have some level of guarantee of an offtake, then it's tough to actually get the OEMs to build the turbines for you, or the units for you, sorry, and then to actually see a long-term cost trajectory which can be financed. So that offtake is now getting activated in different ways, depending on which country you're talking about. A number of the European countries have frameworks, new nuclear frameworks for offtake that are starting to get into shape. In China, in South Korea, you've got offtake that is coming through the system itself. In North America, there's a big, particularly in the US, Canada has a different approach, right? There's a big question around how do you actually get that offtake, and I don't think that's been resolved in the US. So that's one piece. To me, that's offtake is critical, and that offtake then drives the technology cycle. Because if you have offtake, then you can innovate a bit more on the SMR and the micro reactor side. Next to offtake and related to is regulatory. So are there creative regulatory things that are happening, like carve-outs for nuclear? It's not just the support, not just the offtake support, but could you say like half of the new firm build in a certain region will be nuclear? Things like that may come through the form of legislation or regulation or industry agreement could also propel the unlock of regulatory. The third thing is the CapEx and cost side, because that is where the blemish on the industry has been. Now, what's encouraging is when you look at the recent developments in South Korea, I talked about it, I mentioned the one in the Middle East, but other units, if you look at the over 20 units that are being built in China, or at least under in some form of construction, the learning curves are very real and they're very transferable. So we know that when you get crews out there doing construction, how do you drive the scheduling, the work management, the day-to-day construction? We know we can operate better. With offtake, we can get the cost of insurance down. How we construct EPC contracts and de-risk the entire project amongst different parties can also be looked at. Canada is doing some very interesting things around the EPC construct and changing that. So I think there are many lessons to learn from different construction projects going on right now to then transfer that and say, we do have confidence that we can get the cost out. But that's the other big unlock.
Well, let me put two of these dots together, though, because I think Elon Musk just did the 100,000 GPU cluster. And like the way I get my head around it is one of these H100s or A100s is about the energy of a household. So think of about 100, a large town just got added to the system. So Gayatri, over to you. So we talked about offtake agreements, and we famously, I think is it Microsoft looking at buying 3 Mile Island or someone like that? When are we going to start seeing gigawatt clusters? So 1 million GPUs. Is that something that's like off in Star Trek territory? Is that soon? And we're going to have a real pull through? And are two of our arenas going to start talking to each other here?
It's a great crystal ball kind of a question, and I would say if my version of the view on the future here is sooner rather than later. Yeah. Because there are two things that are happening simultaneously here. Michael talked about, there is a technological step change that often is associated with the arena. And we are seeing that in how AI-enabled services have come in, but also like Gen AI, a newish technology, and has taken over the market over the last couple of years, right? So there is that ability to be able to process from a technology perspective that has been significantly on an escalatory curve. And I think on the other side, you see escalatory investments happening. So whether it's R&D, whether it's capital investments, whether it's into products or capabilities, a whole bunch of new players coming in with innovation, investing in, and by the way, not just new players, but also incumbents investing in meaningful ways. And that's where a lot of the talent is going when we look at the high-end real expert talent. So I feel like there will be a convergence because of these two factors coming together. There will be a convergence sooner rather than later.
So, Human, I'm going to come back to you in a second and talk EVs, which is such an archetypal arena and full of new companies and dynamism and races and geopolitics. It's got everything. But first I'm going to go to Arnie and talk about shared autonomous vehicles and robotics. And I can't help but think about Elon's big week he had, where not only we caught a rocket in some chopsticks, but the robots were serving the beer and everyone got, shuttled in on a robo-bus. And, the stat that kind of got me, I heard today, was that Amazon already adds more robots every year than it does people. So it's kind of one of those things that, when we did this New Arenas research, what we found is when we got in the time machine going back to 2005, the arenas were already there. The future was there. It just wasn't big yet. Like Amazon existed, and the first Tesla was about to be launched. So we're starting to, in the same way now, we're starting to see these things really start to bubble. And robots has gone from something that, we used to watch YouTube clips of Boston Dynamics dogs to now, Elon's robot serving everyone beer at the party. So talk to us about shared autonomous vehicles and robotics. And is this just science fiction, or is this real, and are we going to have big industries here soon?
And I think one of the lenses to apply to those two arenas is a translation of AI to sort of the physical world, right? So both the pillars of shared autonomous vehicles and robotics is effectively physical or embodied AI. And I think we are somewhere along the journey, right? We had the first industrial robot in the 1960s at a GM factory in New Jersey to sort of a Jetsons era world with humanoid robotic butlers. I think we're on that journey. What has happened is the first sort of sector to embrace robotics was the industrial sector. They sort of think of the automotive plants with welding robots, painting robots. The advances in the fundamental technology behind it have come from other sectors. So a lot of the techniques and technologies from generative AI, the advances in computing that happen in the semiconductor arena are all bleeding capabilities into robotics that allow you to make robots that are much more dexterous, much more mobile, and much more therefore useful to deploy in real world applications. And you're seeing this in the last sort of 12 months, the amount of capital that has been steered towards sort of humanoid robots that are built on more sort of foundation model based techniques, where I'm not teaching a robot a discrete task, but I'm teaching it a capability, sort of an atomic element of how do you identify an object and pick it. And now I can scale it across different end markets, different actual use cases. And I think that then creates this large market, but also has this escalatory mechanism because the principles for improving your technology become the same principles that have improved technology in generative AI, which is access to data, access to computing power. And sort of, again, that is what's characterizing this sort of physical AI sort of arena between robotics and shared AVs.
Yeah, it's about. I was wondering, why would a robot be shaped like a person? Isn't that just like a sci-fi dream? But if you think about it, most jobs are shaped like people. So the tools, the doorways, they're all people shaped. So it makes sense. Although of course there's going to be lots and lots of different types of robots. But let's talk SAV, shared autonomous vehicles. The analysis we did said that shared autonomous vehicles could actually be cost competitive with a private car really soon, like within 10 years or so. And I just don't even think we've begun to think about how profound this is, because the structure of our cities, the structure of our lives is just so determined by driving places. And not to forget what an incredibly important employment base it is for people. So talk to us about a world that doesn't have taxi drivers in it anymore.
Yeah, I think if you think about the sort of the asset that many people own that is probably least utilized, it's the automobile. 95% of the time, the cars are parked in a parking lot in your house or at the grocery store or the workplace. And the promise of shared autonomous vehicles is creating a network that sort of maximizes utilization of this asset and does so without distractions. The number of sort of traffic fatalities in the US and globally has been improving year over year as technology improved. And then we've seeded some of those gains as distracted driving and incidents around people having their phones out while driving have increased. And shared autonomy not only allows you to reduce the cost of mobility and make it more affordable, it reduces sort of safety risks on the road. And the third thing is, I think it allows you to accelerate decarbonization of the transportation sector because most of this shared autonomous vehicle
It'll be
platforms
electrified.
are also electric vehicles.
Absolutely. And imagine the productivity impact, though, of of commute time. I just think it's incredibly exciting. Now, obviously, the taxi industry was very fragmented and very localized, and then ride sharing service like Didi or Uber or whichever one you use. These are very big, large global companies. So what makes us think that shared autonomous vehicles are going to be a place of mega corporations and really, really high investment and large scale companies? What would drive that?
Yeah,
Excuse the pun.
I think the sort of evidence that we've seen already was, I think, Waymo raised a recent round of another $5.5 billion that valued the company somewhere, in the $50 billion range. I think you have an opportunity to create a sort of a global platform that then can be deployed across cities in the same way that sort of Uber, when it started in San Francisco, was able to go to 120 countries in relatively short order. Now, there is a physical challenge here because this is not a marketplace business. You have to get those vehicles. You need to set up the fleet operations. But if you think of the underlying AI that's driving or self-driving the car, I think that becomes a scalable product that shifts the nature of having to scale a rideshare business. You don't have to go out and find taxi drivers.
Yeah. So, and that's one of the things we were really looking for in these new arenas, not just the big demand, but what's the thing that sparks a real competitive race that drives these kind of radical industry structures we see. So let's come back now to Humayun, because that's a good segue into EVs. But there's also a question, which is another kind of perfect setup, which is how will geopolitics affect the arenas? And obviously, when we've had to think about these arenas and we're projecting out to 2040, which is a crazy thing to try and do, we've got to think about what are the swing factors that are going to make us wrong, and geopolitics is one of them. And EVs is an extraordinary example of how this is not just an industrial race, but it's also a geopolitical race. So, Humayun, bring us back to the focus on EVs. Go for it.
Yes, and Chris, I'm not sure exactly what question you asked, because there are a broad set of questions embedded in that what you
I was
described.
throwing you a lot of interesting leads.
Yes. Okay. So I think, look, when we think about this is a massive industry that is here already. The geopolitical forces are already in play, much like solar. Like when you look at where solar production is coming from and the tariff wars on solar. So it is established, it's huge, it is transformational. Everybody knows that. Yes, we have a charging infrastructure issue. We will resolve that as society because the technology is coming. And maybe there's a bit of a slowdown in the last couple of years. People look at the forecast and they say not as much uptake in EV sales, but in my view, this is a blip. This long-term trend is coming because the cost is coming down, etc. So it comes to your point, this big issue around geopolitics. You look at the trade wars on tariffs, US tariffs on Chinese vehicles, you look at the EU tariffs that went up, you look at the countering tariffs from China, and then you go down the value chain into batteries and battery materials, and you look at what's happening on things like nickel export limits from Indonesia into parts of the world. So this thing has, for the last 5 years, this segment, this arena, has been festering in the trade war industrial policy realm. I think if you were to look at 2040, as you were describing, and you look at the state of play today, regionally, you look at trade, and MGI's looked at a lot of this, I think it'd be hard to say that it won't get even more protective as we go forward. And I think what we would say is the implication for that is there's a bunch of innovation that may happen on the material side and the substitute side. So if you look at battery chemistry and you look at lithium and then lithium alternatives that are coming into play, that's partly a function of geopolitics. So that's innovation being driven by geopolitics. You look at public sector R&D investment, and this is in China, it's in the EU, it's in North America. The increase in public sector R&D into batteries and then EVs broadly, heavy duty commercial fleets, that's also increasing. Again, a reflection of industrial policy at play. And then when you think about what's happening to the downstream services infrastructure and then linking to technology, all the things Gayatri was talking about, cybersecurity in EV networks, that becomes very regionalized. So I think where the EV market flows, particularly in the next 2 years, given the changes that are happening in public policy at the national level across a number of OECD economies, I think will be a marker for how other technologies, including nuclear, including the technologies Gayatri talked about, and what Ani talked about, follow. So to me, this is the sector that will set, I think, a bit of the trend for how geopolitics shapes the other sectors as well.
Yeah, I agree, and it's because globalization happened, and we're so embedded as so enmeshed as a global economy. You can't go back and rebuild all the copper smelters and everything; they're there already. But it's new value chains where it really matters, and this build out of EVs and batteries is unbelievable. We've got a forthcoming study about foreign direct investment, and it's gone. 10 years ago it was all basic materials and oil and gas, and now foreign direct investment is all the arenas. It's semiconductors, it's batteries, and it's renewables related things. So these really are going to be the epicenter of it. Our EVs and batteries are such an interesting case because it's a bit like in the same way that Walmart didn't invent Amazon, General Motors didn't invent the Tesla. And in a part of this new reset of the business model is being really, really good at making engines actually ends up being a liability for you. But the interesting thing, of course, is that the EV and the battery industry are more concentrated than the traditional automotive industry. So do you think that's going to continue? Is EVs going to still be a battle of the giants?
I think if it's a global market, yes, because in the battery space, for example, the top 4 manufacturers, OEMs, have 60% or so, 65% of the market. So high barriers to entry, cost is determined by scale, all of that. So if you have a global marketplace, I think you would see a continued buildup of large players, and maybe some niches like in battery, stationary battery would be different, et cetera. But for the large EV market, I think it would be large concentrated players. Now, if you bring geopolitics in and you break that up, and you regionalize it, then I think you actually adversely have local players you've got more local players that are dominant in specific markets. So I think that's the dynamic that may shift as we look at what may happen here on protectionism.
Yeah, maybe it's like the internet, which has 2 very distinct systems but still very, very large firms in all of them. So we've got 1 minute left. I guess coming to you, Gayatri and Ani, just some closing comments. What do you think these arenas, what do they mean for us today? So we're working in business. What's the implication of this for you in your mind? So Gayatri, why don't you close us out with that question?
I think based on this discussion and all the research we've done, I would say the competitive landscape is going to be will continue to be characterized with significant investments, technological advancements, and then likely the dominance of a few major players and probably a few regional and niche players coming in, driven by the geopolitics and the regulatory environment. But the market is only expected to grow significantly, and will, as much, by the way, will be driven by a demand increase from a consumerization of some of these computational capabilities and technologies.
These are really high stakes games. They're gonna shape countries, and they're gonna shape industries, and ultimately going to shape all of our lives. So thank you for joining us as we explored the next big arenas of competition. Thank you to Michael and Quaylen as well for taking us through the material. We hope you download the report. It's a really big report, but it's modular, so you can kind of take it one bite at a time. And we just look forward to having many, many more conversations about the next big arenas of competition, because that's, in our view, where the future is going to be. So thank you, everybody.